Before the war, Elsa Vasseur lived in a house that smelled of soap and lavender, on a narrow street in Lille where the shutters creaked and the sky hung low like a weighted blanket. Her fingers knew thread like a pianist knows keys. She mended trousers, hemmed skirts, stitched lace into wedding veils, and embroidered tulips onto the handkerchiefs of girls not yet touched by sorrow. Her mother had taught her the craft, and her mother before that quiet women. Their work woven into the seams of ordinary life, holding things together in ways no one noticed until they stopped. The Vasseur women had always been keepers of small things, and in that spring, before the world cracked open, Elsa believed her life would be made of such quietness forever. She would rise before the bell of St. Maurice chimed 7, draw water from the pump, knead the bread, and sip chicory. Coffee in the shadow of the linen she'd hung out to dry. The streets buzzed with bicycles and gossip and the scrape of wooden clogs on cobblestones. There were always children about, carrying fresh milk or swinging satchels heavier than they were. She watched them and smiled. The city breathed in rhythm, then factories exhaling smoke, carts creaking under cabbages and coal, and the clipped conversations of the market stalls. Elsa's world was small, yes, but it was enough. She had just turned 28, and the weight of unmarried womanhood had begun to press around her like too tight gloves. But she had no hunger for the men who came courting with oil-stained fingernails and voices that smelled of onion soup. She was not lonely, exactly. She wrote poems no one would ever read and kept pressed violets between the pages of a worn Bible, and she kept a pigeon coop in the attic, a gift from her late father, who once carried messages during the Franco-Prussian War. Birds are messengers of God, he used to say, and Elsa believed him, because the way they returned home through storm or shot was something close to holy. When the Archduke was shot, she did not understand. The world did not change all at once. The headlines were angry, yes, and the cafes filled with sharp opinions and louder arguments. But the trains still ran, and children still played marbles beneath the bakery window. Life went on as though it would always go on. But slowly, like a slow leak in a sealed room, the air shifted. First came the rumors mobilization in Paris, conscription in the villages, letters from cousins who spoke of uniforms and borders. Then came the soldiers, boots loud on stone, rifles slung like warnings. They marched through town with drums and flags, and people cheered out of habit, not hope. And then the Germans came. It was not with cannon fire, but with an eerie, mechanical quietness. One morning, Elsa awoke and found that Lille no longer belonged to the French. The soldiers stood at every corner, their eyes hidden beneath steel helmets, their mouths tight with foreign orders. Posters appeared on every wall. French was forbidden in public. The shops were closed or commandeered. The cathedral bells fell silent, and with them, something in the people fell silent too. Elsa learned to sew in shadows, behind curtains drawn. Too early, under the gaze of men who watched everything and trusted no one. The first time she lied, it was small. She told a soldier she had no brothers. She told him her father had died of illness, not war. She smiled when he inspected her bag and pretended not to notice the folded note tucked in her hem. Resistance was not yet a word she understood, but something had awakened in her, some low-burning anger, some instinct that life must be protected, even if only in whispers. One evening, as the sun folded its light gently over the rooftops, a man came to her with a letter hidden in his coat. His name was Henry, though he never told her at first. He asked if she could sew a map into the lining of his jacket. She did not ask why. She simply nodded and took the jacket with hands that did not shake. That was how it began. Not with explosions or speeches, but with a needle, a quiet yes, and the breath of a woman who had stitched peace into clothes her whole life and now would stitch defiance instead. The world outside had turned to steel, but inside her, beneath the threads and fabric, behind her steady eyes, Elsa Vasseur was becoming something else entirely. Not a soldier, not a martyr, something quieter, something braver. A woman whose war would be fought with silence and sewing needles, pigeons and prayer, and the birds still flew. War doesn't announce itself with thunder. It creeps, it waits. It takes first the smallest things, the sound of laughter in a square, the comfort of familiar bread, the names of streets suddenly renamed in a foreign tongue. For Elsa, the war reached inside her life not with guns, but with the quiet disappearance of people she loved. Henry, the man with the secret maps, returned, then returned again. His visits were brief and wordless. Each time he brought her messages, codes stitched into scarf fringes, names hidden in handkerchief corners, tiny photographs folded into the hems of coat sleeves. She never asked who sent them. She never asked where they went. To ask was dangerous. To know too much was fatal. But her hands knew. Her hands became traitors to the occupation, and her silence became her armor. It was in the winter of 1915 when the first betrayal bloomed like frost across her window pane. The bakery 2 streets overrun by the Durand family was raided. The mother arrested, the father shot in the alley where he'd once salted dough with ash under his fingernails. Their crime, they said, was harboring French scouts, but Elsa knew. Madame Durand had delivered a wrapped parcel of linen to Elsa, only a week before, linen that had held within it the names of railwaymen who'd sabotaged a German train. Elsa had stitched it with trembling fingers, then passed it on to Henry. Now Madame Durand was gone. Her 2 children stood staring at their father's blood, red against the white snow, while neighbors looked away. Elsa did not cry. She folded the pain into herself like a letter she dared not read again. Henry came less frequently after that. He was changing too, his hands always cold, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "We lost 3 yesterday," he whispered once, his voice rough as gravel. "They hung one of them in Arras, a boy, barely 16. He didn't say more, but Elsa saw it in him, the way he shook when a door slammed, the way he winced when the pigeons fluttered in the attic as if the sound were too much. He had begun to speak in fragments, like a man unraveling at the edges. Still, the work did not stop. Elsa stitched, always in the same room, under the same oil lamp, her heart pounding louder with every movement of the needle. Her mother had died the summer before, quietly in her sleep, without knowing the things Elsa had begun to do. There had been no time to grieve properly. Death was too common now, too ordinary. It came in boots, in uniforms, in quiet knocks at the door. Grief had no ceremony anymore. It simply filled the spaces left behind and stayed there like dust. The pigeons became more important than ever. They carried notes across the lines, tiny scraps tied to their legs, each one a whisper of resistance, flying over a world of mud and fire. Elsa named them for Saint-Luc, Claire, Martin. One of them, a brown-feathered bird with a torn wing she had nursed back to health, she named Josephine. Josephine had flown 13 times without fail, always returning, always faithful. Elsa sometimes wondered if the bird carried part of her heart with it, soaring high above the barbed wire and broken cities. Perhaps that was how she could keep going. Part of her had to fly. Then one evening, Henry didn't come. Not that night. Not the next days passed. And silence pressed down on her like the snow that now buried the streets of Lille. She asked no one. She pretended to sew for German officers. She smiled at guards, but inside something twisted tight. On the fourth day, a boy came barely 12 with a pigeon cage. Henry's there was blood on the corner. He told me to bring this to you if he didn't return, the boy said. Then he vanished into the alley before she could ask more. Inside the cage were 3 pigeons. One of them was Josephine. That night, Elsa lit no lamp. She sat in the dark and wept not for Henry only, but for all that had been stolen, all that would never come back. Her tears were not loud. They slid down her face like ink bleeding into cloth. She had lost someone who had never belonged to her, but whose life had been stitched into hers all the same. And in his absence, something inside her grew sharper not. Rage, not yet, but something near it. Resolve. The next morning, she rose before the sun and fed the birds. She opened her sewing basket and cut a new length of thread. And then, with hands steadier than she thought possible, she began work on a message, a longer one, hidden in layers, meant for someone she had never met. In a place she would never go. She would not stop. She could not stop. War had taken much already, but it had not taken her hands. Not yet. There was no sound more terrifying than quiet in a city under occupation. Silence was not peace. It was suspicion, watching from behind curtains and mirrored windows, where even the pigeons flew softer, as if they too had learned the danger of being heard. In that silence, Elsa Vasseur lived like a thread buried in cloth, hidden, necessary, invisible. The war had reshaped her days. The sun rose, yes, but it no longer meant morning. It meant curfew lifted. It meant boots scraping cobblestone, and the low bark of commands in German. She no longer stitched dresses. She stitched warnings, routes, names, dates. She learned to write with thread, to speak in a language only the brave could read. And yet, the days grew slower, heavier, the streets thinned. Shops were boarded. The smell of fresh bread gave way to the scent of ash and wet stone. People began to disappear without explanation. Teachers, bakers, young men with kind eyes. You'd walk past a home one day and see smoke curling from its chimney, and the next morning the shutters would be nailed shut, a sign on the door in German, evacuated, evacuated, but no one ever saw them go. Elsa's hands stayed busy. It was the only way to stop her mind from fraying. In the early evenings, when the pigeons cooed softly in the attic and the streets outside grew hollow with hunger and fear, she would sit beside the sewing table her father had built and let the needle carry her thoughts. She'd stitched more. Lies than she could remember. Letters that told mothers their sons were well. Letters that said things would be over soon. There was no truth in them, but there was mercy. And sometimes mercy was all one could offer. Her eyes aged faster than her body, the lamplight wore them down, and her vision blurred often now. Her back ached, her lungs rasped. The war ate slowly, not like fire, but like mold quiet creeping. Cruel dot in the square, where once she had bought figs and listened to the children sing, now stood a gallows. It wasn't used every day, but it didn't have to be. Its shadow was enough. One afternoon, as she passed it carrying a loaf of rationed bread and a forged letter in the lining of her coat, she saw a boyno, older than 15, being dragged by 2 soldiers. His mouth was bleeding. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Messenger." That was all. He didn't cry, he didn't beg. He looked out across the crowd with a stillness Elsa would never forget, as if he had already gone. She could not watch the rest, but she heard the snap, and she remembered his shoes, one not tanned the way the pigeons overhead startled and flew, scattering across the cold grey sky. After that, Elsa stopped writing poems. The attic had become her sanctuary. It smelled of feathers and straw and ink. The birds were quiet companions, blinking with dark, unreadable eyes. She had grown especially fond of Josephine, the torn-winged pigeon who had returned from every mission, even the ones that had ended in gunfire or fog. Sometimes Elsa spoke to her, not in words, but in sighs. She would run her finger over the bird's back gently, as if drawing strength from something wild and free. The German soldiers never searched the attic. They searched her hands, her apron, her eyes, but not the attic. She had hidden the false floor well, just as her father had taught her long ago, when he whispered that the smartest weapons were the ones no one suspected. By the spring of 1916, the city was ghost white with silence and cold. The ration queues wrapped around corners like the tails of desperate animals. Children no longer played. They stood with hollow eyes and sharp ribs, learning too young how to wait for things that never came. One evening, a woman named Margot came to Elsa with a child in tow, a boy, eyes wide, shoes made of newspaper and string. Margot was a nurse. She had seen Elsa once at the convent clinic, years ago, before the uniforms arrived. She spoke without looking up. "He's carrying something," she whispered. "They'll find him. He's small, fast, but not invisible." Her voice cracked. "Please." Elsa did not ask what the boy carried. She simply looked at him, trembling, more shadow than Boyand nodded. "He'll need a coat," she said, "and shoes." That night, she stitched until her fingers bled. She lined the coat with a map, the soles of the shoes with paper soaked in vinegar to disguise the ink. When the boy left in the morning, Elsa kissed his forehead and sent Josephine with him. She watched them go from the attic window, a pair of fragile lives walking toward the edge of something vast and unknown. The boy never returned, but Josephine did. She arrived 3 days later, limping and covered in soot, but alive. And in the tiny canister tied to her leg was a message for words in a child's trembling hand. Made it. "Merci, Madame." Elsa sat down then, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to weep not for the loss, but for the strange flicker of life that still burned, even in the coldest corners of the war. She would hold on to that flicker for as long as the birds flew and as long as her hands could stitch. By the summer of 1916, even the pigeons had begun to hesitate before taking flight. The air in Lille grew heavier with each passing month, thicker with suspicion, with betrayal, with the silent pressure of things that could no longer be said aloud. Elsa Vasseur had learned to move like a ghost, to speak in nods and glances, to trust only the birds and the thread in her hand. But inside her, something was beginning to crack. She no longer recognized her reflection, the mirror in her. Room once polished and framed by flowers. Her mother embroidered into the wood now hung dust-covered, dim. Her face looked drawn, older, distant. Her eyes carried the weight of too many secrets. She had long stopped waiting for peace to return. Peace, she now understood, was not something that returned. It had to be rebuilt from ruins, brick by bleeding. Brick. The line between courage and recklessness had become hard to see. The resistance network she quietly served was shrinking. Arrests, informants, hangings. Elsa still sowed the hidden messages, still fed the pigeons, still opened her door to strange knocks and strangers' hands. But the world was colder now, and somewhere deep in her chest, doubt had begun to bloom like frost. It began with a letter, a folded paper, slipped beneath her door late one night, sealed with wax. No name, no greeting, only a command. Do not trust the nurse. Elsa stared at it for hours, her hands motionless, her tea gone cold. The only nurse she knew was Margot, the same woman who had brought the boy to her, the same woman who had once treated Elsa's mother when pneumonia took her voice away. Margot had brought her bread when she was too sick to shop. She had helped bury a neighbor's child without a priest. Could she be an informant? The war had taught Elsa many things. That grief could live alongside love. That bravery often looked like silence. And now that betrayal often wore a familiar face. The next day she went to the church no longer for prayers, but to watch. Margot sat 2 pews ahead. Her head was bowed. Her fingers clutched a rosary, worn and cracked. When she stood to leave, Elsa followed at a distance. Down the Rue du Pont-Neuf, past the butcher's where nothing fresh had hung in months, into a narrow alley near the hospital. Margot knocked twice on a cellar door. Waited. It opened. Elsa could not see who greeted her, only that Margot handed over something. A package, flat, wrapped in brown cloth. She returned home sick with fear. That night she didn't sleep. She sat by the pigeons, listening to their feathers shift. Her fingers ached to stitch to make use of the fear, to bind it to something useful. But no thread could mend the crack that now ran through her trust. 3 nights later, Elsa's world collapsed again. They came for her neighbor, old Monsieur Aubry, who played violin in the square when the Germans first arrived, and who had once passed her a note sewn into his coat's collar. They dragged him down the stairs, past Elsa's door, his slippers scraping the floor. He did not fight. He did not cry. He only looked at her through the crack of her door one glance, brief and hollow. In the morning there was blood where he had stood. She nearly sent word to the others, nearly warned them that someone was leaking names. But her fear betrayed her first. She sat paralyzed, unsure who to believe, afraid her words might fall into the wrong hands. She said nothing, and then the boy returned. Not the same one, not the same eyes, but another, barely more than 12, with bruises on his legs and a message pressed into the sole of his shoe. He said he had come from across the line, that someone named Henry had told the others she could be trusted. Henry, the name fell from the boy's lips, like a stone dropped in a well. Elsa stared. She hadn't heard it in over a year. Her voice cracked. You saw him? The boy nodded. He walks with a cane now, and he still has the ring with the lion on it. The ring, she had kissed it once, without knowing why. Her hands began to move before her mind did. She took the message. She read it, decoded it, and buried it into a jacket's inner seam. But her heart beat louder than ever before. Henry was alive, and worse, he still believed in her. That belief terrified her more than any knock on the door. That night, the nurse returned. Margot came quietly, her coat damp from rain, her hands trembling. She did not carry a package this time. She carried news. They're watching the attic, she said. You need to move the birds. Tonight, Elsa stared at her. Why are you telling me this? Margot's eyes filled. Because the boy you saved, the one you gave shoes to, he was my nephew. Elsa said nothing. She only stepped aside and let her in. That night, beneath the weight of betrayal and belief, fear and hope, Elsa and Margot moved the pigeons quiet as breath, careful as prayer. They did not speak again. The attic stood empty by dawn, but the message had been sent, and somewhere, beyond the trenches and smoke, a man with a limp and a lion's ring would know that Elsa Vasseur had chosen to trust again despite everything. By the winter of 1917, Elsa Vasseur could no longer remember the sound of true silence. Not the silence of fear or waiting or hiding, but real silence. The kind that once lived in the corners of a bakery or beneath the rustle of linens drying in the sun. That silence had died long ago, buried under the echo of boots and whispered names that vanished by morning. Even the birds were quiet now. She had moved them twice more since Margot's warning, once to the rafters of a half-crumbled granary, once again to a barn outside the city, where a blind farmer tended a field that no longer grew. Josephine was still flying, though her feathers had gone grey at the edges. Elsa visited her only by moonlight. Every step was dangerous now. The resistance was fraying. Fewer messages came, fewer hands to pass them. The Germans were tightening their grip raids, curfews, arrests. Anyone could be a spy. Anyone could vanish. And Elsa, who had spent years now stitching false hope and real danger into cloth, was no longer certain if she was saving lives or only delaying their deaths then. One night, the trap snapped shut. She returned home from the granary. In the early dark, her shoes soaked through, her fingers blue with cold. The stairs creaked louder than usual. Something in the stillness felt off. She paused at the landing, breath caught. Her door was open. The apartment was untouched, and yet completely wrong. A chair slightly turned. A drawer left ajar. She stepped. Inside slowly, hands trembling. On the table sat a sewing basket. Her sewing basket, but it was open. Inside, her secrets lay exposed needles, false hems, coded thread, and a note: "We are watching." No name. No demand. Just that sentence, written in perfect, calm French. Elsa did not scream. She did not cry. She simply sat down, slowly, like a woman lowering herself into cold water. Her heart moved differently now, not in beats, but in hammer strikes. She knew what it meant. They had searched, but not arrested her, which meant someone had spoken for her, or spared her for now. She had to act. She had to disappear. But before she could, the knock came. She opened the door to two men in grey uniforms and a third figure who stepped out from the shadows like smoke. A woman, her hair pulled tight, her eyes cold and sharp. "Margot, search." "The attic," she said. It took Elsa a moment to understand. Margot had betrayed her. There had been no nephew, no memory of the boy that had been a lie to win trust, to gain entry. The warning had been part of the plan. They had emptied the attic, themselves searched it in advance. The birds were already gone. But Margot was here now to deliver the final blow, to paint Elsa as ungrateful, guilty, exposed. "Where are they?" Margot asked softly, as if the question were part of a lullaby. Elsa didn't speak. Her mouth was stone, her throat ash. The men stormed past her, boots thudding up the stairs. She could hear furniture scraping, things falling, drawers breaking open. She closed her eyes. Then something unexpected. One of the men shouted, curses, a loud crash. They had found nothing, because she had moved it all. She turned to Margot. Then their eyes locked. Elsa saw something flicker. Was it fear? No, not fear. Regret. You didn't find them, Elsa said quietly. No, Margot said. But we will. The soldiers left, but they would be back. That was certain. Elsa stood alone in the doorway for a long time after they were gone, her heart a hollow drum. That night she lit a fire, not to warm herself, not to cook, but to burn everything. Letters, codes, journals, the false seams of coats, the map drawn in oil on linen, her father's pigeon ledger, her poems. The thread dyed with invisible ink. The fire glowed against the walls like something holy and destructive at once. She fed it all, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to take. The flames licked away her history. The smoke carried her, scenes upward, and when it was over, she stood in the cold and let the silence take her. But the work was not finished. She walked through the night, across the snow-laced streets of Lille, to the barn outside the city. The farmer let her in without a word. She opened the cage. Josephine blinked at her. Elsa attached one final message, shaking as she tied the thread. No code, no cipher. Just 3 words, they know. Go. She lifted Josephine into the dark, and the pigeon flew into the wind, into the fireless sky, into whatever hope was still left. That night, Elsa did not return home. She vanished, like so many others before her, but her message flew, and someone, somewhere, read it. She walked for 3 days, out of Lille, across fields stiff with frost and black with the scars of shellfire, past the places where trees had been torn from the earth like teeth, where barbed wire still coiled like dead snakes in the grass. The sky remained low, grey, heavy. No birds sang, only crows. The pigeons did not fly here. Elsa Vasseur had no destination, only movement. Only the urge to stay ahead of whatever waited behind. She slept in sheds, in cellars, once in a trench so abandoned it had become a grave. Her hands, once known for delicacy, were cracked now, black beneath the nails. Her shoes had split at the soles. Her breath whistled with exhaustion. But still, she walked. She had not seen her reflection since the night of the fire. But she imagined what she looked like. Not a seamstress, not a spy, not even a woman anymore, just a body moving through a landscape that had forgotten the meaning of names. It was on the 4th night that she reached the farmhouse. It rose like a ghost from the earth. 2 walls caved in, roof sagging, chimney broken, but inside there was warmth. A stove lit, a candle burning, and a man waiting. Henry, his beard was longer now, his shoulders bent with pain. He walked with a cane and carried the same lion's ring on his finger, as if to prove he hadn't disappeared entirely. When he saw her, he didn't speak. He simply opened the door wider and let her fall into his arms. For the first time in years, Elsa let herself be held. That night, they spoke without words. Her body trembled against him, and he wrapped a blanket around her like a vow. He had not stayed in one place long, too dangerous, but the network had narrowed, fewer routes, fewer safe houses, and now fewer names. He told her what he knew. Margot was dead, shot, they said, by the same officers she had served. Perhaps to silence her. Perhaps because her usefulness had ended. No one mourned her. No one buried her. She had simply vanished, the way all traitors eventually did. Josephine had arrived safely. Her message had warned 3 others. 2 had escaped. 1 had not. His body had been found with a strip of linen sewn into his collar, a map Elsa had made. Henry carried it still, folded into a tin inside his coat, not as a keepsake. As a reminder, the war was nearing its end, they said, but no one believed it, not really. Peace was a rumor, like spring, something distant, something beautiful, something no one dared imagine aloud. They stayed in the farmhouse for 5 days. Elsa stitched nothing. She rested, slept for hours at a time, woke only when the wind howled or the roof creaked. Her dreams were heavy, not with images, but with silence, the kind she had once prayed for, the kind that now felt unbearable. On the 6th day, a child came, a girl, 9, maybe 10, thin as bone, dressed in a coat too big for her. She knocked on the door, barefoot, holding a note in both hands. Henry read it, then he folded it, slowly. "They're asking for you," he said. Elsa didn't need to ask who they were. She looked at the child. "How far?" "Not far," the girl said. "But we have to go now." Henry stood. "You don't have to do this," he said, but she did. She knew that there were still messages to carry, still names to protect, still codes that only she could sew. She turned to him. "I burned everything," she said. "The basket, the book, even the poems." He nodded. "But I didn't burn the thread." He smiled, then a tired smile, full of things unsaid. "Then you're not finished." They didn't embrace. There was no time. He pressed something into her palm. The lion's ring. She tried to refuse it, but he closed her fingers around it. "If I don't see you again," he said, "you'll still carry me." And then she left, into the dusk, into the war, into whatever waited ahead. The girl led her through woods, along frozen rivers, across land so scarred it no longer had a name. They traveled in silence, and when they arrived, the door opened without a word. Inside, a table, a lamp, a new sewing basket, and 3 pigeons. Elsa sat. She unwrapped her coat, picked up the needle dot her fingers had not forgotten. She began again. The guns did not fall silent all at once. The end came slowly, like the last breath of a dying manraged, halting, disbelieved. Even after the armistice was signed, the soil still trembled with distant shelling, as if the war were unwilling to release its grip. No flags were raised in Elsa's part of France, no parades, only a strange stillness that settled over the cities like smoke from a fire that had burned too long. Elsa Vasseur heard the news in a whisper. A boy rode into the village where she now lived, a place too small for maps, too broken for names, and called out in a voice half hope, half warning, "It's over." No one cheered. They stood in doorways, frozen in disbelief. What did over mean when husbands had not returned, and homes were gone, and children no longer remembered laughter? What did peace mean when the dead could not rise to greet it? Elsa said nothing. She simply went to the barn, unlatched the pigeon coop, and watched the birds look skyward, uncertain. Josephine did not fly. She stayed near Elsa's hand, blinking slowly, as if she too was waiting for something more than just quiet. A week later, Elsa returned to Lille. The city had survived, but only in pieces. Whole blocks had vanished. Her apartment was a blackened husk, scorched from within. She walked the street she once knew like a lover's face, now unfamiliar in its ruin. The market was gone. The church doors were splintered. The square where Monsieur Aubry had played violin was just a square agenti, blank, unmoored from memory. but the birds still flew. She kept her head down. She wore mourning black, though she had no family left to mourn. It helped her blend in. People did not ask questions of the quiet. They had enough grief of their own. At the edge of the city, she found Henry. He was not waiting. He was working, rebuilding walls, lifting stones with a body to warn for labor, his cane resting beside a half-raised doorframe. He looked up when he saw her, and the years between them fell away like leaves in wind. They didn't embrace. They didn't need to. They walked together for hours, past the ruins, past the ghosts, past the memories that clung to buildings like ivy. He told her about the others, those who had made it, those who had not. He spoke of the boy with the false shoes, who'd lived and become a teacher in the South. Of the child who once delivered a ring and now worked in a bakery that served bread without ration stamps. They never spoke of Margot, nor of what was taken. Some silences deserved to remain untouched. Later, when the sun dipped below the edge of the rooftops, Henry brought out a box, wooden, simple, inside a spool of thread, a thimble, a pair of rusted scissors, and beneath them a single folded square of linen. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was a map, faded, hand-drawn, with her stitchwork still intact. She traced the lines with one finger. He said, "I kept it because I thought someday they'd want to know how we did it, how we survived." Elsa looked at him. "Do they?" "No," he said. "But I do." She smiled, not wide, just enough. That night they sat beside a new fire, not one born of fear or sacrifice, but warmth. No secrets passed between them. No lies. Just a quiet companionship shaped by years of carrying invisible burdens. Josephine rested in a corner. Feathers dull now, but her eyes still bright. The war had ended, but not the work. In the months that followed, Elsa taught girls to sew again, not with codes or false linings, but real stitches, soft hems, the kind that held rather than hid, the kind that mothers made, the kind that spoke of beginning, not ending. And yet there were moments when a bird would cry or a window would bang. In the wind, when she would remember, not with fear, but with something deeper, a tenderness so sharp it hurt. One spring morning, she found Josephine dead in the coop. Her wings folded neatly, as if she had chosen the moment herself. Elsa buried her in the garden behind the house. No marker, no stone, just the silence. But even then, when she stood over the earth, her hands empty for the first time in years, Elsa did not feel hollow, because the thread had not broken. The world was stitching itself back together, painfully, unevenly, but it was stitching, and she had been part of that, not by fighting, but by flying, by waiting, by enduring.